Justin took the cable that sat near the baskets and moved the short distance to the derelict tree. Paul kept up his chatter, but the words passed Justin in the wind. Both ends of the cable had a spliced loop. Justin wrapped the cable around the tree and passed the length of the steel rope through one of the loops, forming a cinch around the tree. He pushed the cinch up the tree and over a couple of lumps in the soft bark to hold the loop in place. As he backed away, he played out the cable. Paul rose and took the other end. He doubled a small section of the steel wire, forming an open loop, which he then passed through the spliced loop. Paul stuck his arm through the cinch to support the cable's weight. "Things are going good." He looked at his father. "That place we're looking for? I'm sure it's near that water we saw." He paused. "You were right. At least, I'm pretty sure you are." Justin picked up the axe and ran his thumb over the edge. "Not very sharp. I might have to knock it down instead of chopping." He shuffled back down to the tree. Paul turned and trudged up the slope toward a short, broad stump over which he intended to pass the wire cinch. Justin guessed the honey tree to be close to 3 feet in diameter at the base. "This shouldn't take long." As Paul neared the stump, Justin picked a spot on the tree and took his first swing. To Justin's utter surprise, the axe head buried itself in the soft wood. The tree shuddered, and large amounts of debris cascaded down. Justin raised his left forearm to fend off the falling rot. Without looking up, he pulled the axe free of the tree. A loud cracking sound split the air, followed by a deep groan. At the same moment, a strong breeze blew across the mesa. The hulk of wood started to topple amidst a storm of tiny particles. Justin raised his head to shout to Paul, but the flying debris entered his mouth and choked his words. The falling tree quickly took the slack out of the cable. Snare-like, the cable bit into Paul's wrist. He screamed in pain as it yanked him off his feet and onto his back. The tree hit the ground and broke in two, both ends rolling toward the cliff's edge, dragging Paul, who clawed at the ground with his free hand. Justin struck a blow with the axe at the wire snake moving through the grass. The effect, nil. He dropped the axe and grabbed the snake, but its strength was beyond his. The tree continued to roll and slide toward the edge. Justin retrieved the axe. His eyes flushed, and sickness stirred in his stomach. His mind fought for control. He stood 2 feet from the steel snake, powerless to kill it. The tree would drop at great speed after it went over the edge. Paul slid toward him, a scant 10 feet away. Paul strained his head back and saw another horror. He saw the clear image of the man he loved against the bright blue sky, the man's eyes wide, his teeth bared, the axe high, and most dreadfully, his loud, distinctive scream that pierced Paul's ears with its meaning. I must. Oh, Jesus, I must. When the moment to strike came, Justin bellowed from the depths of his belly, and the axe whizzed through the air, centrifugal force trying to pull it from his grip. But Justin persisted, and his ears refused to hear the pleadings of his son. Only a loud hum filled his head. The axe struck about 4 inches above Paul's wrist. At the moment the tool made contact, the sun flashed off the blade's steel and blasted Justin's eyes. They closed. Fate spared the father the sight of separation, but the man felt the splash of warm blood on his face, and its moving force drove the red liquid through the spaces of his clenched teeth. He knew its taste. In the canyon, within a cool cave, 3 women turned in unison toward an agonized wail. sadness permeated the cave for weeks. Depression oozed from tragedy after tragedy, saturating the environment with the oppressiveness of cold steam. Nicole's shrunken and twisted muscles protested whenever manipulated, but she avoided any audible display of her discomfort. When standing erect, her head could turn only a few degrees in either direction, but she persisted. More dreadful were her recurring reflections. These were sickening moments with images of killing dogs, the feel of fangs, and the flow of warm blood. This always led to fits of vomiting and retching that tormented her twisted muscles. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her, and she would lie upon her bed, capable of nothing. Her conscious moments achieved minimal comfort. The sight of Paul's short, heavily bandaged arm brought tears to her eyes, and then there was the boy's father. For the most part he was quiet, and dullness shadowed his once sparkling eyes. Shemaine told her mother the story of what happened on the mesa, a story that required Justin 3 days to tell, a story that did not include the trepidation and the hysteria of the moments when he struggled to get his son back to the cave. Justin often doubled in stomach pain, but still he went about his routine work. Rarely did his eyes make contact with Nicole's, an avoidance on both their parts, their faces, mirrors too revealing, guilt dripping. Michelle again functioned as the doctor on the day of her brother's injury. The wound, clean and neat, was all the more terrifying. The young girl performed the operation, but not without revulsion. Shemaine stayed with her, and together they managed. These shared terrors produced a bond that made them sisters as they picked up the pieces of the mind-shattering events. Paul made a quick recovery. Clear, conscious thought came in a matter of days, but his feverish stare lingered for weeks. He showed a disregard for the physical pain. Shemaine sat at Paul's side, changing his bandages. She adopted Michelle's style of explaining the situation with each inspection. "The cut is clean, and there's no sign of infection." Paul stared with stern eyes. "I miss my hand. Half of what I can do is gone." Shemaine washed the stump with a solution of herbs and water. "You'll find ways to do things." She looked at him. "It's a matter of time." Paul's eyes shadowed. "What good is an arm without a hand?" Paul blinked and his face contorted. "I've seen people with missing limbs." His lips twisted. "Compensating or not, I found them revolting." She cringed and tears welled. "That's immature." She tried to smile. "The wound doesn't bother me at all." Shemaine bowed her head. "Your father is in a lot of pain." Paul looked up at the cave ceiling. "As to my father," he paused, "I fight not to hate him. I've gone through the moments again and again." His voice cracked. "It was the only thing to do." Shemaine concluded Paul's treatment. Justin watched Shemaine tend to Paul. Neither saw his stare. Justin twinged with stomach pain and continued to linger in a hell of culpability and love. Time heals. Gradually, Nicole and Justin overcame their stress-induced shyness and spent more time together. This encounter had distinctiveness. Encased in suffering and extensive guilt, the cosmetic shrouds of superficial concerns were stormed away, stimulating moments of utter flexibility. Nicole responded intuitively. She felt Justin's warmth, like the feel of an old friend. She lost count of the number of times she caught herself just before reaching out to kiss him at some casual moment. Whenever he turned his back and walked away, she knew the separation was temporary. The involvement of the two adults did not go unnoticed by Paul, Michel, or Chimène. The apparent interest the elders showed for one another found a way into their conversations and was warmly received. The youngsters often found reasons to leave them alone. Nicole moved about the cave with increasing ease. Her efforts with self-therapy had good results, although she still limped. The wounds from the dog attack healed, but the stitching, the work of an amateur, resulted in deformities on her left side. Paul softened to the events at the top of the mesa, and eventually thanked his father for what he had done. He confronted the frustration of the missing hand with Michel's help, who fashioned a deer antler into a two-pronged tool that he tied to his stump. Justin absorbed most of Paul's workloads. His wound would never heal, and he silently adjusted to its closeness. He forced optimism in the presence of the others, but he felt exhausted. He found solace with Nicole, a pleasant distraction for his mind, and the thoughts of the settlement to the south always lifted his spirits. Michel bubbled with energy. She made no bones about the fact that she wanted to get underway. She kept close track of the recovery of the injured. She supplied the nursing and made sure they ate. She talked almost constantly about the trip and commenced the task of making preparations. Chimène mourned her sister, assisted her mother, and consoled Paul. Her demeanor was emphatically sad, but she delighted at her mother's interest in Justin. A few weeks passed, and all were ready to tackle the quest to reach the settlement on the coast. On a clear, warm day, they talked enthusiastically. Michel stood at the entrance to the cave, her pack shouldered. The others stood in line behind her. Her eyes scanned the rock hollow. "It's been a good shelter, but I hope we don't have to come back." She smiled and turned the corner away from the cave. The others, without comment, patted the wall at the entrance and followed Michel into the open. Nature's touch of late seemed peaceful, or so it appeared. The group moved at a slow, leisurely pace, following a river flowing east, sure it would lead them to the sea they sought. Although they carried food, additional food was abundant. The absence of any signs of either dogs or goons added to their comfort, and for that matter, they encountered nothing at all of a life-threatening nature. The pleasantness of travel heightened their morale and amplified their optimism. One week into the trip, the travelers were resting and taking their noon meal. They sat on the southern slope of a low hill just above the river. They chatted light-heartedly as they passed bits of food. Justin held the field glasses to his eyes and scrutinized the banks of the stream. The shallow river sparkled like broken glass. Abruptly, Justin's sweeping movement stopped, and he leaned as if to get closer to what he viewed. He straightened, lowered the glasses, and ran a hand across his sweaty brow. He took a shallow breath and put the glasses back to his eyes. Without moving, he spoke. "Paul, come over here. I want you to take a look at this." Paul ambled over. "What's up?" Justin handed him the glasses and pointed. "Over there. I want to be sure I'm not hallucinating." Paul reclined across a rock and propped his right elbow to steady the binoculars. "What am I looking for?" Justin made no comment. Suddenly, Paul stiffened and leaned forward as his father had done. "No shit." He looked at his father. "3 men standing on the river bank?" Justin smiled. "They're not goons." Paul put the glasses back to his face. "By their dress, they're not goons." Justin slapped his thighs. "That's it. People." Paul stood up. "From the settlement?" Justin's eyes brightened. "How's the arm?" Paul understood the inquiry. "It's uncomfortable. Throbs when I move it. Slows me down. Take Michelle." Justin nodded. "After we're gone, explain to the others. Then follow at any pace." He turned. "Michelle, come with me. We have to check something out." He patted Paul on the shoulder and handed him the glasses. "Take these and check on us, to make sure all is going well. They have to be the people we're looking for." He retrieved his pack and started down the slope. Michelle ran after him, putting her pack on as she did. As she passed Paul, she questioned him. "What's up?" Paul smiled and said nothing. She soon caught up to her father. "What's doing? What's going on?" Justin moved at a fast pace. "We saw 3 men on the river bank, less than a mile off." "3 men? So we go to meet them?" Justin slowed and then stopped. "We better stay out of sight." He looked at Michelle. "Get closer. Make sure it's safe." Michelle smiled. "You think they're from the place, by the sea?" "We're close to the sea. If they're not from the place, they must know about it." Justin started walking. He followed the river, staying close to the brush line, guided by a mental image of the river turns and the location of the 3 men. "One more bend and we'll be pretty close." At the bend, Justin turned to Michelle. "Let's get into the brush." They snaked through mesquite bushes, half crouched. The bush stifled the breeze flowing with the river. Michelle touched her father's shoulder and pointed. Between some branches they could see the 3 men, 2 standing and a third kneeling on one knee. He pointed a stick in one direction, and his other hand pointed down at something in front of him. Justin smiled. "They're not goons." He bit his lip. "I think we can take a chance. Paul's watching." Michelle took another look. "Let's do it." She smiled broadly and started to walk toward them. Justin grabbed her shoulder. "Hold on. I'll make contact and you watch from here. If it's okay, you'll know." Michelle nodded. "Okay, I'll wait." Justin moved into the open. He kept his hands around his mouth. "Hello! Hello!" Then again louder and slowly. "Hello! Hello!" When the 3 men turned, Justin walked toward them. They were young, without beards, and wore their hair long. They appeared fit and well fed. Justin's appearance made little change in their manner, and they simply waited for his arrival. Justin extended a hand. "Hi, I'm Justin." One of the men, tall, blond with blue eyes, reached for his hand. "Good day. I'm Jason, and this is Scotty." He pointed to the man on one knee. Scotty had rugged features, a jagged scar across his nose, his eyes soft and doe-like. The third, looking the youngest and smallest, grinned broadly. He had dark skin and very black hair, a handsome face with African features. "Hi, the name's Abdul. Everybody calls me Abby." His eyes squinted. "Where in the hell did you come from?" Justin grinned. "Oregon." Jason released Justin's hand. "That's a long walk." Scotty stood, and all 3 men looked beyond Justin. Justin turned, rightly guessing that Michelle approached. He grinned. "That's my daughter, Michelle." Abby poked Scotty in the ribs. Scotty knocked his hand away and smiled. "Any more like that?" Justin's eyes sparkled at the question. Michelle rushed to Justin's side. She gripped his left arm tightly. Her eyes widened with interest. Justin could hear her anxious breath. Her right hand jutted out to the closest male, and she almost shouted her name. "I'm Michelle." All the young men smiled and bumped among themselves to extend a hand in greeting. The gravel bar projected out into the river, and the shifting feet made grinding noises as the small stones rubbed against one another. Paul, grimacing, emerged from the tree line and jogged toward the gathering. When he arrived, Justin had already informed the others of his name. They answered in near unison. "Hello, Paul." A surge of chatter ensued. Next, walking at the river edge, Shemaine and Nicole appeared from around the river bend. Nicole could not sustain a fast pace, and Shemaine gave her some support. Justin could see their smiles. He turned to Scotty. "We're in search of a settlement. We were told it's on the shore of a new inland sea." Justin's eyebrows lifted. Scotty nodded. "You've come the right way. It's where we're from." Justin smiled. "Music to my ears. Oh, yes. Music to my ears." Scotty gave him an inquisitive look and tilted his head. "Heard about us, huh?" His eyes shifted to his companions and back to Justin. "We'll talk about that later." Justin announced the good news to his party. Shemaine cried in Nicole's arms. Another man came out of the south. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, black hair, and black penetrating eyes. A hunter, he walked with a light step. As he approached, he spoke to himself. "Shabby bunch. Must have been in the wild for a long time." He studied the man with a missing hand and soil bandages, and then his eyes shifted to the large man with brown hair and a beard touched with gray. "I bet they have a tale to tell." A woman stood with her back to him. He focused on the shape of her bottom. "I hope the front is as nice as the back." He quickened his step and came up behind her, putting his hand on her shoulder. Michelle jumped at the touch and spun around to see his manly and handsome face. Their eyes met, and the man spoke his name softly. "I'm Griffin." Michelle blinked. "Michelle. My name is Michelle." She reached for his hand, but he turned toward the others in another exchange of names and greetings. The 4 men from the coast had scattered earlier in the day to locate game. They chose the gravel bar as a place to assemble and discuss their findings. With the arrival of the strangers, the hunters lost interest in previous plans. Abby extended an invitation. "We have lots of food at camp. No need to stand around in the gravel. Let's cook up a big meal." He looked at Paul and Nicole. "You can get medical attention back at the cavern." Paul turned to Nicole, a silly smile on his face. "Medical attention? They can give us medical attention." Abby smiled. "Oh, yeah. We have a few doctors and a place for them to work. Lots of medicine and some equipment." Scotty questioned. "You'll be coming to the settlement, right?" Justin smiled. "You bet. Most definitely." In a jovial mood, the group moved downstream. Griffin turned about, taking a few steps backward, eyeing Michelle once more. She gave him a subdued wave, but her eyes were telltale. The group walked slowly in the late afternoon. The hunters were constantly probed for information about their home. They stated its location on the extended portion of the Gulf of Mexico, which covered just about all of Texas. A long one-day's march from their campsite would get them there. In less than an hour they arrived at the hunters' camp. A fire soon crackled and a meal was prepared. All were very hungry, and it wasn't until their bellies were full that conversation settled into a leisurely flow. With a little persuasion, Griffin gave a brief description and history of the settlement. Griffin stood up and rubbed his eyes. "There's a lot to tell." His eyes shifted to each of his companions. "You guys give me a hand if I screw up." He smiled and looked at the travelers. "It's been a long day. Try to save most of your questions till we get to the cavern." He took a deep breath. The place, which we call New Atlantis, has been in existence, that is to say, a habitation, since some years before the bad times. He raised one finger in the air. Oh, yeah. It's a cavern, by the way. A big hole in a cliffside. He smiled at his companions, who chuckled in response. Griffin turned to face Justin. The fellow that found it was a geologist, Mr. Noah Shosky. He worked for a mining company and found the cave when looking for any mineral of value. Because of its size and all the passages, he spent a lot of time there. Griffin sipped his tea and winked at Michelle over the cup's edge. His interest was scientific. However, the world was turning to shit, and another notion came to mind. Using the place as a shelter in case of some sort of disaster or if society collapsed. Scotty spoke in dramatic tone. A secret society came into existence. His eyes squinted. It was called Swan Song. Abby added more information. The founder and all but two of the original society are dead. Griffin continued in a quick, factual manner. The idea turned into a project to make the cavern livable. They also decided that mere survival wasn't enough. They concocted a reconstruction plan for when the bad times passed. Paul interrupted. We had a little plan like that. Griffin looked at him. Well, let's hope the time is close. The group sighed in unison. Griffin drank more tea. They gathered supplies and people as well, from all over the world. A very intelligent lot from a wide range of fields. They were given an open invitation to find shelter at the cavern whenever they wanted. In return, they were asked to contribute to the supplies and ideas. They were also asked not to make the issue public. Griffin sat down as close as he could to Michelle. Replies came from everywhere. The money rolled in, the supplies rolled in, as well as ideas. At the location of the cavern, only a small group existed, and only a few of the minor projects were put together. He smiled. No doubt those contacted considered their investment as well-spent insurance. He looked into Michelle's eyes in the same way he had when they first met. Michelle slid a short space away and spoke without emotion. Please go on. It's very interesting. Griffin's stare continued. When the world actually began to fall apart, those contacted started to show up. Scientists, physicians, biologists, physicists, and so on. Equal numbers of people representing the arts arrived as well. Dancers, musicians, sculptors, painters, and others. Most came with their families and a few friends, but that was expected. He thought for a moment. Oh, yeah, no pets allowed. Griffin looked at the group in a general way. Space was available for all. The final number was small in comparison to the number contacted, but this too was expected. In all, at the start of the bad years, there were close to 1,000 men, women, and children. Most of us, I mean the guys here, were the youngsters that came with the invited ones. A full moon shined, and the fire burned high. Abby stood up and left the circle. Griffin watched him as he talked. Of course, there were many difficulties. He looked at Michelle. And there still are. He turned away from her. But there's order, an organization, and things move smoothly. He smirked. Most of the time. Michelle got up and walked over to Shemaine. Griffin raised his voice and spoke in her direction. There were also periods of misunderstandings. Michelle looked down at the seated Shemaine. Is he watching me? I think he just committed the shape of your ass to memory. Michelle smiled approvingly and sat down near Nicole, who sat next to Justin. Griffin continued. During the earthquakes, the cavern was a dangerous place to live. People moved out, but stayed near. But lives were still lost with each quake. And then the lowlands began to fill with seawater. He paused. This used to be a very dry place. Griffin stood up as Abby came back holding a small ceramic jug. He held it up. "Whiskey, of a sort." He walked over to Justin. "You're the oldest. Please, have the first." Justin took the jug. My, it's been a long time." He pulled the stopper and took a swig, paused, and took another. "Thanks." And he handed it back. Abby passed the jug on, and all took swigs. Griffin sat down. He rested his forearms on his thighs, and his hands massaged one another as he spoke. "After the climate change, people came from everywhere." He paused. "There was a lot of fighting." He wrinkled his nose. "The place stunk with the smell of rotting vegetation and animals. The land got soft." He paused and looked at his feet. "Disease came, and a lot of people died. There were dead to bury almost every day." He took a breath and looked up. But the population still remained close to 1,000. Griffin's discomfort with this part of the story was obvious. Starvation was not an issue. We had lots of supplies. He ran his fingers through his hair. And the dead always left more behind for the living. He stopped again and thought for a moment. "Well, enough of that." And he waved his hand through the air. "Let me tell you some good things." He swallowed another swig from the jug and passed it. "Deep within the cave, there are hot pools that produce a lot of steam. The engineers channeled it to where it was needed and then used the condensate for drinking water and bathing. The system is still in use. Recently, the boiling has increased and allowed for an extension of the ductwork." Griffin rubbed his eyes, stood up, looked for the jug, found it, took another swig, and sat down. He scanned around the group and stopped at Abby. "I'm just going to tell them about the expeditions and leave it there." Abby shrugged his shoulders. "Sure, that'll be good enough." Griffin started again. "We had plenty of food and other stuff." He waved a hand through the air. "In the name of humanity and to add to our number, it was decided to send out scouts in all 4 directions." The words clicked in Justin's head. He stood up, and Griffin nodded in acknowledgment. "I met a man back in California just before he died. He wore buckskins like yours. He was the one who told us to come this way." Abby questioned Justin. "Was he alone? Can you give me more information as to what he looked like?" Justin did his best with the description, and it was enough. Abby took a deep breath. "You met Malcolm. He and 5 others had gone west, but never returned." He paused a short moment. "He was a good friend. I still had hopes." He bowed his head. Jason said his first words to the group. "He was my uncle. Prior to the bad years, he had a great career in biology. He published a few books. That whole thing about looking for other people was his idea. I remember how insistent he was about being the one to go west, to persuade the people of the value of the effort. Some thought it would just bring more trouble, but he said it was something we had to do." Abby rubbed his chin. "He told me that he knew the area to the west and was sure there were people in need." Griffin tossed a stick into the fire. "In any case, he talked everybody into it, and they went on their way. His group was one of the 2 parties that never returned. Only half of the group that went east returned, and they came back with ugly stories of subhuman people. Those that went south came back with similar stories and met people who chose to stay where they were. They also found out that the Americas are now separated by a sea of water. In the end, these efforts were considered a failure, and no more trips were planned." Nicole spoke up. "You made no mention of the group that went north?" Griffin looked up. "Oh, yeah. They as well never came back." Nicole lowered her head. I believe they died at the place I came from." Nicole told the story about the siege and her escape. At the conclusion of her story she stood up, struggling to stand straight. "They died, and we survived, and I'm here now. I will always be deeply grateful for their efforts." Justin stood up as she sat down. "Their efforts did produce results. We are 5 saved people, and who's to say there'll be no more? The expeditions were not failures." He raised the jug of whiskey. "I toast the fallen." Everyone stood, and the jug was passed. At this point individuals talked among themselves, and others drifted away in small groups. Justin, preoccupied with thoughts of Malcolm, wandered away from the noise and fire. A potent sensation of predestination swirled in his contemplation. Justin's chest rose and fell with slow, deep breaths, and he whispered into the cosmos, "Malcolm, I'm here." He turned toward the moon. "But why here?" Justin's mind clicked through the events of the past, looking for clues. His head lowered, and an image of Nicole formed. Then his heart twisted, and he doubled over, gripping his stomach. "Paul, oh, Paul, my heart bleeds." The surge of pain evaporated. He stood erect, and he wiped a tear from his eye. Justin looked back toward the camp. The fire blazed higher, and revealed the silhouette of a person coming toward him. Nicole. She had watched him leave the campsite, feeling his presence move away. Now she moved toward him and thought, "Where are we going, Justin? What are we doing?" She could only see his shadow against the blue night sky, and when she reached him, she wrapped her arms around him and placed her head on his chest. "Stay here with me. It's been a special day." And he did. The preparations for the short trip back to the cavern took all of the next day. They packed the meat and hides, built litters, and stuffed backpacks. A lot of work, to be sure. Paul did his best to help, and he took special interest in the equipment of the hunting party. Their weapons were bow and arrow, although they carried pistols as sidearms. Paul, curious, questioned Abby. "I see you have pistols, but I don't see rifles. Why not?" Abby explained. "We do have rifles, and at one time we did our hunting with them. But the noise scared off much of the game, and at the same time attracted attention." Abby finished tying a cord around a piece of rolled-up deer hide and looked at Paul. "Back at the cavern we have more firearms and a large supply of ammunition that will last a long time." He stood up and put a hand on Paul's shoulder. "The present rule at the settlement is that firearms are to be used for defense only. Hunting is to be done by bow and arrow." Abby pulled on Paul's shoulder. "Let's get a cup of tea." They walked to the campfire and poured a cup. When they sat down, Abby continued. "There used to be a lot of controversy on the subject of firearms. Some were singularly opposed to them, considered them dangerous, accidents, fights, that kind of stuff." Abby took a sip of the very hot tea. Paul sat his cup down. "It's starting to sound like my father's reasoning." He looked at Abby. "Which was good. Guns and ammunition would have been a big hassle." Paul's head went down. "I can't use a bow anymore." Abby smiled. "Hold on there. We have craftsmen and tools at the cave. I'm sure they can come up with something." Paul's eyes lit up. "You think? Something to hold on to a bow with? It doesn't sound like a big deal to me." Paul looked at his stump, his brow wrinkled. Abby patted Paul on the knee. "They'll come up with something. Hang in there. Paul smiled. "Finish what you were telling me about the firearms." Abby squinted. "Well, let's see. Oh, it was also thought that the weapons might bring people looking for them if somehow the word got out." Abby paused. "On the other hand, they proved their value more than once, if you know what I mean." He knitted his fingers together. "Many lives have been saved because of them. They hand them out only when a group leaves the cave, like this hunting trip." He drank more tea. "Most people are satisfied with the bows and arrows." Jason chuckled. "The survival of your group, 2 men and 3 women, alone in the wilderness for so long without firearms? That'll be a story by itself." Abby studied Paul for a moment. "I've got lots of questions, but I'll wait." Paul smiled. "And I for you. Do you guys fish in that new sea?" A long conversation ensued, and a friendship grew. The next morning, while still dark, the campsite stirred into action. The trip would require most of the daylight hours if they traveled at a moderate speed. After chomping down some leftover meat and a cup or 2 of hot tea, the group headed out. All were accomplished travelers, and they quickly fell into a rhythm of movement. As the day progressed, the air temperature rose into the 90s, and Nicole showed signs of fatigue. Abby went to her side. "Would you like to rest for a bit?" Nicole smiled. "No, no. I've pushed hard for months. I can handle this." The land about the river varied from plush to sparse, the result of an ecosystem in transformation. The once dry, scrubby desert, now moist, had a blend of plants not normally mixed. The cactus drooped with flesh gone soft, and at times the sweetish smell of decaying plants drifted in the humid and still air. Justin walked near Nicole. "The new sea must be adding to the humidity. I think this place will probably turn into a jungle." Nicole turned her head toward Justin and grunted from a stab of pain. "I've been walking for 1,000 years." She managed a small smile. "But I don't know if it's forward or backward." Justin reached behind himself and adjusted his backpack. "It's forward." He took a few more steps. "It's always forward." Nicole, now accustomed to Justin's philosophical chatter, smiled. His beliefs were unique and interesting, and something akin to Matthew's. "You don't believe in the devil, do you?" Justin paused a moment in thought. "Well, if life is an illusion, then anything is possible." He took a few long steps and turned to face her. "Except for free will." He smiled. Nicole smirked. "No free will? That's outrageous." Justin continued in his backward strides. "If you're part of an illusion, how can you have control?" He turned and walked at her side. Nicole remained quiet for a few steps. "Well, I can truthfully say that the present situation was not my idea." They both laughed. Justin adjusted his backpack again. "I know what you mean, and after I'm dead, there's a few questions I'm going to ask." He smiled broadly. Nicole's eyes lit up. "Yeah, me too. I think I'll start a list." Justin nodded. "There's just some shit I see no reason for." He smiled again and hurried forward. "I want to ask Paul something. Be back in a bit." Nicole watched him trot away. Her thoughts drifted to the past. The little pond and the near-death situations, Adam's supplies, finding Justin, finding the hunters. Lucky stuff, I guess. She looked at Justin's back. "I'm only going to think from step to step." Nicole smiled as her mind unexpectedly conjured an image of a blue sea surging with huge waves, and the singing of humpback whales. The travelers made a few brief stops at newly opened fissures from which steam issued. Abby explained, "It's of interest to the scientists back at New Atlantis. We were asked to estimate if the activity is increased. Some think another disaster is in the making." By early evening the caravan arrived at the mouth of the river and the new inland sea. Although it was not truly an ocean, it was enough to lighten the heart of both Justin and Paul. At once, Justin fantasized about sailing or swimming. He questioned Abby. "How well established is the sea life?" "I'm told that the marine life has made good progress. Lots of sea plants and sea birds and fish and crab." He looked seaward. "Most of the fish are migratory, and at times there are few about. Still, the waters are our main source of protein. The hunting for land game is mostly for a change in diet and supplying leather." Griffin moved up to them. He pointed toward the waters and smiled. "One day the reincarnated soul of Jacques Cousteau will dive below these waters and rise to the surface, gasping with unbelievable news. 'I've found Texas. It really did exist.'" Justin laughed. Presently the contingent turned inland and ascended a steep grade to a high plateau and snaked around huge white boulders. The soil, sandy and white, had few plants. To their left, high sheer cliffs of white rock curved slowly to the west and then to the north before dropping sharply to the sea in the east. It was a half circle, a crescent moon laying on its side. The walls stood in the shadow of a day near over, but the mornings were sure to catch the first sun rays of the new days. Near the top and to the north on the west wall gaped the opening of a huge cavern. Nicole stood at Justin's side. "That's stunning. Absolutely awesome." The mouth of the cave was carved into a perfect circle. It set on the inside base of an equilateral triangle, not touching the adjacent sides. The triangle protruded from the cliff, a pyramid emerging from white stone. The spectacle was not without color. The space within the pyramid was painted sapphire blue, giving the illusion of a black ball suspended in the sea. The frontal view of a humpback whale hovered above the ball. Its pectoral fins extended to either side of the sphere. Painted shafts of light descended from the apex of the pyramid. The sculptural notion projected an intensity that ignored its location and soared into the southeast. Both Justin and Nicole turned as if to see the circumstance of the cavern's interest. The hunters watched as the new arrivals took in the brilliant sight. Griffin stepped to them. "Stunning, isn't it?" He smiled. "The cliff stone is quite soft and easy to work with, and, as previously mentioned, there are many artists among us." He followed their stare to the sea. "Do you see something out there?" Nicole looked at Justin, but spoke to Griffin. "No, I just felt something." Justin blinked. "It was like someone turned me, made me look." Griffin continued, "The outside work is not complete, and there's more art inside." Justin took a deep breath. "It's much more than I expected." Michelle strolled over to Griffin. "Are you an artist?" Griffin smiled. "You bet. I work with paint. I love colors." The party moved directly toward the north wall. Carved into the cliff wall, a footpath, much like a three-sided tunnel, ascended to the cavern entrance. A small group of people waited at the base of the path and relieved the arriving party of their burdens. The hunters were first in line, followed by Nicole, Justin, Shemaine, Paul, and Michelle. The trail was meticulously carved, although steep. Nearly 5 feet wide and smooth, it rose steeply, with broad, flat platforms every 10 feet. To the left and east of the ascending party, the vast new sea sprawled across the horizon. Paul, Michel, and Chemaine laughed, chattered, and pointed fingers. Justin periodically whispered in Nicole's ear or kissed her on the cheek. She openly laughed, oblivious to the tears on her cheek. The opening to the cavern rose 30 feet in height, and a smooth raised path led inward to a round central stage 100 feet in diameter. The inner overhead ascended to over 100 feet, and the girth of the cave spread to over 300 feet. A small adobe village with some structures 2 stories high lined both sides of the cavern. Huge murals of lavish colors added life to the walls. Most were duplications of prehistoric cave paintings from the Ice Age. The rest were interesting abstractions that blended with the cave art. Sculptures, 2 of great size, stood at the inner sides of the entrance, sensuous shapes that hinted at the female form. The blackened walls above them suggested that fire once blazed on their flattened tops. Small statues graced the areas about the adobes. Their styles were varied. A few whale forms were carved into the cave walls. They depicted graceful movement and had a definite metaphysical feel. Justin, Nicole, Paul, Chemaine, and Michel stood at the entrance and at the start of an ivory path that descended to a central stage. The stage was painted the same blue as the sea on the outer wall. Here most of the populace awaited their arrival, dressed in a mixture of buckskin and linen. Some of the women wore sleeveless robes in a variety of colors. The men of the hunting party led the contingent to the center of the circle. Standing separate, a group of 3 men and 3 women waited. All the hunters, except Abby, drifted to the side of the circle and were greeted with handshakes and pats on the back. Abby walked up to the group of 6 and turned to Justin, waving him to his side. "Over here, Justin, over here." Justin complied with quick steps. Abby put his hand on Justin's shoulder and introduced him. "This is Justin. We found him and his group a day's walk from here." He smiled at Justin. "This, Justin, is our governmental group." He pointed to the individuals. "Jeanette, our chairwoman, and her staff, Buchiak, Aquilino, Lorna, Miko, and Hamish." Justin shook hands with all, and they welcomed him and his group. The crowd of bystanders closed in with growing elation. Formalities began to dissolve with the excitement for the 5 from the wilderness. The crowd talked loudly, making normal conversation impossible. Abby pulled Justin closer and waved to the people. "Hold on, hold on." The noise continued. As Justin stood at Abby's side, he pondered the forms of Nicole, Paul, Chemaine, and Michel. Against the background of these clean, well-groomed cave-dwellers, he was astonished at the tattered and decrepit appearance of his tiny group. He had become used to their rags and the messy, unkempt hair, but now, compared to these people, they were spots of grease on white linen. Justin felt his scruffy beard with one hand, and he fingered a tear in his trousers with the other. Abby spoke some words to the crowd, and they fell quiet. Justin, nudged by Abby, heard his voice pronounce the names of Nicole and Paul as he studied the sight of their dirty bandages. Then he looked at Michel and Chemaine. For him, during the entire journey, they were young female flowers. He had seen only their charm and beauty. Now, their appearance was almost humorous. He pointed to them and spoke their names. They simply stood there smiling, oblivious to their own shabbiness. A lump rose in Justin's throat. The noise of the crowd burst into his ears. He straightened, and his chest expanded with a deep breath. He looked at his group again, and a broad smile crossed his face, and tears watered his eyes. Jeanette suddenly spoke in a voice both clear and strong. "We bid the new arrivals welcome and express admiration and amazement in regard to their survival." The populace broke into cheers. They surged forward to shout questions at the bewildered arrivals. At that point, a male committee member, Aquilino, with a booming voice, came to their rescue and managed to quiet the crowd. He turned to the new arrivals. "With your permission, women, over here," and he pointed to his left, "and men, over here," and he pointed to his right. Once separated, he spoke again. "With your permission, allow us to give you a short examination by our medical staff, to be followed by a hot bath and a change of clothing." Justin looked at the others. They all smiled with faces lit with wonder. Jeanette came forward again. "After which," she smiled at the little group and turned to the populace, "these wanderers of the wilderness will be our guests of honor at a celebration." The crowd cheered. She waved for silence. The crowd quieted. "I now request the preparations be made." Again there was a great cheer, and everyone moved off in different directions. Nicole, Michel, and Chemaine were escorted in one direction, and the two men in another. The medical examination consisted of a quick look at sustained injuries, a bandage change, an inquiry into any other problems, and lastly, an injection of vitamins. Next came the hot bath. Justin and Paul were led by one of the male committee members, Buciak. He spoke with a Slavic accent and had an austere manner. Not quite 40, a physicist, he spent years working on a solar power project not far to the east. Sadly, he was the last member of his family. His wife and 3 children died in some tragedy at the cave. A twisting trail, lit by oil lamps, led to the hot baths deep within the cave. Buciak explained. "At first there were only hot water streams running through the lower levels. We dug pools and channeled water to them. Each pool gets a continuous flow of hot water, with the excess overflowing back to the main stream. The chambers around the pools were enlarged, and other smaller rooms were dug into the rock, producing a very nice bathing spa." Buciak had actually understated the place. It was exotic, to say the least. The chambers were large, and oil lamps flickered red and yellow, their intensity mellowed by the passing steam clouds. Numerous stalactites, some were carved nudes in the style of ancients, adorned the passageway. Evolving stalactites dripped into tiny pools. In the places where steam condensed, the drip-off stimulated musical chimes that sang softly. The tones were cooling to the warm place. The hot streams were beyond sight, hidden in the darkness where the cave ceiling dropped to a narrow slit that required a man to stoop to enter. The floors of the baths were shaven smooth, and wooden benches provided places to rest. Shallow stalls, carved into the rock, cascaded with continuous streams of condensate, pouring off protruding stones, soft as rain itself. Buciak explained. "Far upstream, ductwork gathers the cool condensate." He smiled. "Most pleasant after a hot mineral soaking." Paul nudged Justin. "Hot pools and cool showers. Can this place be real?" Buciak frowned. "There has been an increase in the water temperature, and that's a concern. But the baths are still very enjoyable." Justin smiled. "Do you have racquetball?" Buciak's expression became serious. "Yes, we do, but you have to be a member, and you'll need ID for that." He suddenly laughed in a very deep and loud voice that ran through the chambers like thunder. Justin looked at Paul with raised eyebrows. A few moments later, at the bathing pools, Buciak pointed. "The women of your party are not very far downstream." Perhaps you wish to join them?" Neither Paul nor Justin answered. They were already removing their clothing. When naked, the men went to the pools and slowly immersed till only their heads bobbed. Neither spoke, as heat penetrated deep into flesh and bone. Buciak stood at the pool. "I'll leave you for now. Shortly a lady will be here with soap and other things. Enjoy. I'll be back later." Justin peered through droopy eyes. "Thank you, Buciak. I am so pleased." Paul added, "Oh, yeah, this is great." Their bodies tingled with increased sensitivity as the hardened outer layer of dead skin stripped away to expose the pink and tender below. Muscles warmed to incredible looseness, and heat invaded the joints. For Paul's aching stump, the relief was immense. Some minutes later a woman entered the chamber. She was beautiful, a redhead, and wore a white linen gown that clung to her voluptuous form. She flashed a bright grin and sauntered to the pool's edge. "My name is Oceana. I'm a barber and a masseuse." Paul ogled. Green eyes. I don't know if I've ever seen green eyes. Oceana smiled again. "I'll take that as a compliment." She bent her knees in a crouch and sat 2 vials at the pool's edge, along with a couple of gourd body scrubbers. The vials contained soap. It's peppermint. Very refreshing. I highly recommend it. She winked at Paul. "I won't be far off. Just call my name if you need something." She turned and sashayed from the chamber. Paul looked at Justin. "Wahoo!" Justin blinked. "Lily-white skin and amber-red hair. My, my." He turned to the soap. "Peppermint." He looked at Paul. "Peppermint." Paul chuckled. "That's right, Dad. Peppermint." Justin stood in the waist-deep water. "Oh, my," he smiled. "Peppermint." He pulled himself from the pool and looked at Paul. "Peppermint." Justin picked up a scrubbing sponge and soap. On weak legs he ambled to one of the showers. As he stepped in, he sucked a quick breath. "Ooh, cooler than I thought." The soft water caressed his body with a smooth touch, and he relaxed. He poured a liberal amount of soap on the scrubber and put it to his nose. "Paul?" Paul turned. Justin extended the frothy sponge. "Peppermint." He ran the pad across his chest, and large gobs of frothy suds erupted. He studied the bubbles. Paul climbed out of the pool, strolled to a shower, and dipped under the cascading water. A few moments later he went to Justin and extended the sponge. "Some peppermint, please." Justin poured a copious amount, and Paul returned to his shower. Justin poured soap on his head and sighed. "Oh, my. It's a summer breeze." He smiled broadly as Paul sudsed up. Justin repeated the scrubbing of his body, and he stepped back into the shower, tingling with new tenderness. Water gurgled over his head, and he thought of Nicole. A couple of minutes later, he stepped from the shower and went to his son to assist him with some of the scrubbing. Later, Justin re-entered the hot pool. His skin, with amplified sensitivity, induced chills as he sank to his neck. Paul joined him, and they quietly allowed the time to tick away. Oceana returned. "Excuse me." The men opened their eyes and looked up. "Sorry to disturb you." She hung 2 robes on pegs protruding from the wall and flashed another brilliant smile. "Is there anything you need, or perhaps want?" The men shook their head, watching her every step. She pointed toward a different passageway. "Through there is a resting room. You can lie down, and there's refreshments as well. I can also cut your hair there and give you a shave, if you like." She smiled again and left. Paul turned to Justin. "Are you going to cut off your beard?" Justin didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." "Me too." Reluctantly, they exited the hot waters. Tottering, they retrieved the robes and headed for the resting chamber. Oceana, waiting for them, stood up and handed each a large ceramic cup. "It's a mild fruit wine. Raspberry." She directed them to a couple of cots. "Rest a while. I'll be back shortly." The men drank a few gulps of the wine and laid back on the cots. 15 minutes later, Buciak joined them. "Are things proceeding well enough?" The men, recovered, sat up on the cots. Paul responded, "I can't tell you how fine I feel. I have a new body, new skin." He drank more of the wine. Buciak fetched a large clay pitcher in the corner and refilled their cups. "This would be a good time to explain how this community works." Justin rotated on the cot to face Buciak. "Yes, I'd be very interested in that. The hunters, the ones that brought us here, gave us some of the history." "Good. I'm pleased to hear that." He sat down on a bench near them. "This place is very liberal in nature, with leadership composed of a committee of 6. He emphasized the word liberal with a bit of disdain. "These positions are filled on a rotating basis. In fact, if you stay long enough, you'll eventually be asked to serve. The colony has gone through a lot of hard times, and as such, we are composed of mature individuals who accept self-responsibility and understand the need for honest behavior. To date, there has been little need for heavy-handed authority." He paused. "So far." Buciak stood up and poured himself a glass of wine. "Personally, I think a little authority is wise." He looked at Justin. "Some call me a hard nose and even insecure, but I see nothing wrong with a few rules and the threat of punishment to back them up." He thought a moment and looked up. "They tend to ignore me. They say I have little flexibility and fear in my heart." He turned back to the men. "They say it lowers my survival ratings." He drank some wine. "In these troubled times." His mouth twisted and he paused in thought. "Oh well, enough. Supplies of food and medicine are plentiful. However, we are a bit low on hand tools, rope, equipment such as that. On the other hand, we have an abundance of musical instruments, painting, and sculpting supplies." His eyebrows rose high on his forehead, and he leaned toward the men, his voice again sarcastic. "I'm sure there are enough violins and brass to supply the New York Philharmonic, and enough canvas and paint to fill a few museums." Paul extended his glass, and Buciak filled it. "We were told that you have many scientists here." "Yes. In fact, we are mostly scientists. Little laboratories are set up here and there with many ongoing experiments. Our major project, and one acknowledged most important, is the development of new energy sources, solar power being the prime interest. I lead that team." At that moment, Oceana entered the chamber. Paul sat up straight. Justin smiled. She gave Buciak a passing glance. "Hi, the barber's here." She went to a small table near a chair. With precision she laid out her tools, scissors, razors, and combs. She turned to the men. "Who's first?" Paul quickly got to his feet and moved to the chair near Oceana. "Me. I'm Paul." Oceana gave him a big smile. "Shaving a haircut?" Her hips swayed as if to music. Paul sat down. "You bet. All of the beard, and you can do what you want to with my head." Oceana moved to a position behind him and swirled a cloth around his neck. "Let's start with the beard." And she picked up the scissors. Buciak's eyes followed every movement Oceana made. "Well, I doubt you two can concentrate with lovely Oceana around." Oceana smirked. Buchiak backed out of the chamber. "I'll return later, after Oceana has done her thing." Oceana dropped the scissors to her side and frowned. She said nothing and watched Buchiak leave. She raised the scissors again and clipped at Paul's beard. "He can be such a pain." She brushed a few loose hairs from Paul's beard. "But he's been through a lot." Her hands went to her hips, and she thought for a moment. "And haven't we all?" She started to clip again. Justin propped himself up on one arm to watch the shearing of his son. "I've forgotten the details of what you look like." Oceana's ample body swayed beneath her thin gown. She cut handfuls of his beard close to the skin, and Paul's barbaric appearance softened. When only stubble remained, she whipped soap into a froth and painted his lower face. It took less than 5 minutes for Oceana to remove the rest of Paul's facial hair. The change was startling. Paul's uncovered youth glowed.